All right. Sorry, I'm trying to adjust my screen so I can see some of you. So again, as we go through this, you are welcome to ask questions. I will maybe ask Jen to help monitor that chat for me, because it struggles for me to monitor the chat as I'm talking through things here. But if you have stuff that comes up and want to, you can ask it in this group, or you can throw it into the chat and I'll try to address it, and we'll keep talking here. So I'm assuming that everybody is seeing the presentation here. Maybe
looks good. Looks good. Yep.
Jen, do you want to do the Zoom, anything for Zoom basics besides what's written on the screen that you wanted to?
Yep. Just a couple of reminders. I think this morning we're doing a great job. Just stay muted unless you are speaking. The call is being recorded, so we have already started recording. You can share feedback and questions in the chat. If you're not familiar with the chat, if you go down to the middle of your toolbar, sometimes the toolbar doesn't pop up unless you put your cursor over it. It's going to be at the bottom of the viewing screen. You can go to scroll over chat, click on that, and another window will open up and you'll be able to throw questions or comments or thoughts into that chat. And also something that's important to know about this is that you can adjust the view by going to the upper right-hand corner, and you may want to do gallery, side by side with gallery, or side by side with speaker. And if you do side by side with speaker, then you will see primarily Jeremy today. And if you do side by side with gallery, you'll see other people who have their camera on as well. And that's it. Thank you so much.
So it's Jen and I talking today. But yeah, I'm gonna kind of hop into this. So you may recognize this this mural as one of the newest additions to the Heartside neighborhood here along South Division. This was put up this summer, and the artist is pictured down below there. That's a mural of a few of the business owners here in Grand Rapids, or historic business owners that ran a business in along South Division or in the Heartside neighborhood here a few decades ago. So we're going to be talking about history today, right? And we're going to be specifically looking at African American history here in Grand Rapids. And so this is not kind of necessarily a celebratory review of Grand Rapids history today. This is kind of looking at some of the challenges that we face in our history and some of the things that have contributed to racialized outcomes in our community. And so as we kind of walk through the history exercise today and some of the statistics of what it means for today, I'm really going to be talking through it and trying to offer you a perspective that the history of Grand Rapids as it relates to kind of African American and the contributions and the limitations that people have placed on the contributions of African Americans in our community continue to have impacts for Grand Rapids today. And really, I'm offering that the work of Dwelling Place ought to be thinking about this history and ought to be thinking about the racialized outcomes that Grand Rapids has historically produced as we continue to think about our work and what our work means and what it means to do good work and good affordable housing work. I'm going to be kind of talking through how housing specifically has played a significant part in kind of creating structures that create racialized outcomes. And again, the term racialized outcomes I use to kind of mean that when you look at statistics, you can, if you look at how African Americans or Hispanics or Latinos are doing compared to white population, you see differences and disparities between the outcomes that we're getting. And so that's, I refer to that as racialized outcomes if you're not used to that terminology. So again, as I go through this, some of the things that I share, I hope are new information. Some may be pretty familiar to you. All of this information I'm sharing comes from this book, A City Within a City. And so this was written by Todd Robinson, who is not necessarily from Grand Rapids. He's actually a professor in Kansas right now, University of Kansas. But he wrote a book talking about the civil rights movement, and kind of his premise is that oftentimes we talk about the civil rights movement in this country from the perspective of large cities, of what happens in places like Detroit and Chicago, but not often from the perspective of small cities and yet most African Americans in that time were living in smaller towns or smaller cities. He also says that particularly the story of African Americans in smaller cities in the North is very underrepresented in history. And so that was kind of what he was trying to bring to light. And so when he was looking for an example, or what he did was he used Grand Rapids as kind of his case study for how racism existed and was perpetuated across America in many communities. And so the book it is an academic book. It's not always the easiest reading. If you're looking for something you can breeze through easily on a soft Sunday afternoon, that's not the book for you. But if you are willing to kind of dig through some academic writing for the first chapter, particularly in the book's probably the most academic in the book. But after that, it does get to some great stories of kind of African Americans. And so if you're familiar with Grand Rapids, particularly Southeast Grand Rapids, which is where I live and where I have been working for the last 20 years, it really does do a great job of kind of connecting some of the places that we are very familiar with and see every day, and have some of the historic context to it. So again, the general premise of the book is that in smaller towns, racism is managed, that discrimination goes on, that it happens, but that the community does not view the problem as racism itself. The community tends to view a problem as when racism gets too bad, then businesses are impacted. And the problem is that businesses and the business community is impacted by discrimination. And so the community responds to reduce those challenges for the businesses without actually taking on the root causes of racism. And so that's really the premise of his book today. And we won't go too far into that theory or that story today. But if it's something you are interested in, would highly encourage you to read this book. It really is, for those of us in Grand Rapids who want to know more about it, it really is a great book. I think he has another book coming out. The book, A City Within a City, starts from around the 1920s and runs through the 1980 and covers that period of history. And I think he has a new book that's coming from concentrating more in the late 70s till about 2000. So there may be more from that. So if you're looking for a area of his interest to you, it's definitely worth reading this book. So again, I'm going to keep kind of going through, and throughout this there'll be slides that I show. I won't read the slides. They do have a lot of words on there. You are very welcome to read those as you or instead of listening to me. But my goal here is just to kind of highlight some things from this book, and I've kind of organize the titles on these to talk about different aspects of life in Grand Rapids. And so oftentimes when we think about how racism shows up in people's lives and how it is experienced, we kind of think through more of a social connectivity issue, right? Of segregation is not knowing other people or what's happening around that and how we are interacting with people. And there's definitely that has been a piece of Grand Rapids history. So this slide is kind of sometimes from 1925, right? The picture on the right-hand corner is Division Avenue, and it's a Ku Klux Klan rally that is going down and marching down Division Avenue in 1925. And as a kind of the wording there explains, a lot of people were marched through the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of them were not even hooded, right? It was not an area of being so involved in outright discrimination and harassment of African Americans. It was something of shame within the community. Many people were willing to be associated with that. And it really was a part of life in a way that's in many ways hard for us to believe right now, but it's 100 years ago or a little less than that. This was happening right outside our offices here in South Division. The same thing was happening again. We hear about kind of segregation and often think of that as a Deep South conversation, the separation of white and black water fountains, or the segregation of balcony seating for African Americans and whites being able to sit on the main floor of movie theaters. But that was part of Grand Rapids history as well. In 1925, there was a case of a theater discriminating, an African American getting arrested and thrown out of a theater because he wanted to sit on the main floor. And it went to Supreme Court of Michigan, and the theater won. Or the theater won in lower courts. They ended up winning at the individual plaintiff won in Supreme Court. But this type of kind of social separation was an everyday part of Grand Rapids life in the 1920s and 30s, and really kind of carried on beyond that as well. So again, I think one of the things that we don't often talk about is how kind of, for those Jim Crow laws, right, the legal segregation that happened in the country is most often told from a Southern perspective, but it manifested itself in many ways in the North, and Grand Rapids was not exempt from that either. This is also really telling. Again, I did not pull it. There's a lot in the book about kind of employment and history, and how segregation and racism and discrimination impacted African Americans' livelihoods and their ability to find work and do work. But here's a couple stats that I think really kind of speak to how prevalent discrimination in workforce environment was in Grand Rapids in the first half of the 20th century here. Grand Rapids is known as Furniture City. 54 companies working around these things in the turn of the last century, and none of them were hire African Americans. So the main job, the main livelihood, the main wealth building mechanisms in our community were intentionally and outrightly discriminated against African Americans, preventing African Americans from having stable income, from entering middle income communities, from really participating in the majority of economic life of our city. And again, this did not go away as the furniture industry changed. By 1940, even the public utilities, municipal offices, right, insurance companies, banks, some of these bigger things that again continue to make up a big part of the Grand Rapids job economy and jobs. 3,900 jobs, only 11 African Americans were working in them, right? So it wasn't that it was explicitly stated that they could not be hired, but in practice, those opportunities were denied to people. And if you think about what it means to be part of a community, what it is that, right, a lot of us recognize and choose to live in places where we get to know our neighbors, where we get to be part of all those other things that go along with it, right? Who you know makes a big difference in your life. And when you have social limitations that really prevent certain people from being able to get to know other people, and you have other outright discrimination that prevents people from being able to work and find jobs and get the best paying jobs, it creates structures and prevents opportunities from whole families being able to move forward and advance in their lives. And so that is part of kind of Grand Rapids history. And it continues to have impacts to this day. And again, I'm gonna keep talking. I'm not seeing kind of chats here. So Jed, I'm trusting that you will interrupt me if people are throwing anything in there. And I do encourage anybody to have questions and wants to share them to do so. But I'm gonna kind of keep moving forward here. And again, this is my first time kind of doing a presentation like this on Zoom. Usually when I talk through history stuff, I try not to talk so much because I am not a history professor and cannot always be the most entertaining person around these things. But welcome any feedback and stuff. So even if you want to put your camera on for me so I can see your face a little bit more, I would appreciate that. And I will keep talking about how housing has been a big piece of this. And again, the book talks about Grand Rapids, and I will continue talking about Grand Rapids because this is a real part of our own history here in this community. And also this is a national conversation, right? Grand Rapids is not unique. Again, how things show up, and our community does have a unique history around these things. It is ours, and I think there's value in us acknowledging and recognizing that. But also it is unfortunately very similar to a lot of other communities. And one way that racism showed up and continues to be perpetuated is through housing policies. In 1934 to 1957, the Federal Housing Administration, right, that they underwrite mortgages. The system that was created in order to create home ownership opportunities. Prior to the 1930s, very few people own their own homes, right? It was a pretty rare thing outside of rural communities. And even in rural communities, homeownership was not a easily accessible activity, right? The FHA came along and kind of created this thing called the 30-year mortgage, that you could get one mortgage that would last for 30 years. And that did not, it's very typical. Again, we expect that to be common, but that did not exist before that. Before that, you would need to pay at least 20% down. You would get a mortgage that they would give you 7 years to pay it back. And after 7 years, you need to either get another mortgage or pay it off your original loan. And that's not something that most people could take the risk on figuring out. And so the FHA really kind of created this whole new path where people got to become homeowners. And it is a big component to what created for the first time, United States got a larger middle class. And instead of having a large segregated haves and have-nots, there became this middle category of middle income folks in the city, right? And it wasn't just because of homeownership. It connected to some growing manufacturing sector and some labor movement reforms that created things like a weekend and work hours and higher wages. But all those things combined to create what we now, again, assume to be part of every day and always around of this middle class concept that people go to work for a while, everybody has some leisure time in their lives, and home ownership is a big part of everyone's lives. But within this federal policy that was created, within this kind of concept of creating home ownership, the federal government had to underwrite mortgages, right? So they got to decide who got mortgages and who didn't, and they created the standards for doing that. Within that, they rated neighborhoods and they kind of identified which communities could qualify for these loans and which ones could not. And so they had 4 levels of rating, A, B, C, and D. And any neighborhood that had more than 1% mixed race, meaning 1% of the population was not the same as everybody else, had a D rating. So if a community had 1% African Americans living in it, that whole community would not be eligible for FHA loans, or if they did, they paid a premium higher rate on the loans that they did. And for the most part, those communities really did not have access to FHA backing on mortgages. So that had a ton of implications, right? It meant that in the 1930s and 40s, it was common and legal to discriminate based on race, right? This is before the Civil Rights Act, before fair housing regulations. So at this time, people could just say, I will not sell to you because you are Black. And it happened all the time, right? And there was this policy particularly created a financial incentive for everybody to be doing this. If you think of it from a developer, what happened in developments in Grand Rapids is in places like Alger Heights, right? Where we are kind of the edge of the neighborhood where we're looking at doing our project at 2080 Union. That neighborhood was built during this era. And as a result, developers, when they were building homes, included in the title of the land, explicit prohibitions that ran with the deed, covenants running with the deed that said no African American could ever buy this house. And we built entire neighborhoods that way in the city of Grand Rapids. And we, if you look at, so this is a map that was produced for the FHA. This is, I think it's from the 1930s. I couldn't find the exact date on there, but I think it's from the late 30s when this was produced. And as you're looking at this, the yellow areas are the highest rating areas. The greens are the highest rated areas. The yellows are the next highest. The blues are the middle categories, and the pinks are the lowest, the D rating areas. Again, I think you can see my cursor moving here. Can I get a nod from somebody if you can, right? So this is the Baxter neighborhood, and this is Division Avenue here. So So the white part of here is downtown. It wasn't a predominantly residential neighborhood, so it did not get rated. But these areas, so this is Wealthy Street here. The area on either side of Wealthy Street and just south of Wealthy Street between Eastern and Fuller, these were the 2 neighborhoods in the city where African Americans were allowed to live. So these were predominantly African American neighborhoods that existed prior to the 1960s. And again, this area of Grand Rapids continues to be the place where is has been predominantly African American ever since then, right? So this part down here, right? If you, again, Grand Rapids history, most of Grand Rapids ran to about this line here, which is about Hall Street, maybe Burton, until the 1920s. And then most of this area south of it was built after the Depression and after into World War II in 1940s, and then into the 1950s is where the rest of this whole parts of the city were built. So again, if you think about Grand Rapids, for those of you who know it, this is kind of in many ways the 1950s suburban communities, right? We think of them in Grand Rapids and not suburbs anymore, but these are the single family homes. Everybody has their own house, their own driveway, a little bit of space. And that's what we were building in the 1950s. And that was really powered by this FHA concept that everybody could become a homeowner and we could provide mortgages to allow people to move out of crowded apartment buildings into single family home ownership. And the notion that everybody needed a little bit more space and they needed, right? Everybody wanted a picket fence and it was starting to get into cars in that time and just a little bit more space. And so that created most of the city of Grand Rapids. And I think it is often easy for us to ignore the fact that the federal government at the same time was saying African Americans could not participate in this growth and prosperity. We weren't just creating a middle class as a country, we were intentionally creating a white middle class as a country. And the same thing was happening in Grand Rapids. And so again, so 1950s, right? So this is about a decade into the growth of here. So again, if you're looking at Grand Rapids boundaries here, prior to 1950s, this was neighborhoods, but it was not densely populated. It wasn't necessarily looking like it is right now. Most of this yellow area you can kind of see in here is just, there's no streets, right? These are just large tracts of land. There's a couple streets that are starting to go into these areas. But most of this was built during this 1950s era. And so in that time, 60% of non-white housing units are owner occupied, and 50% of Black residents had resources to purchase their homes, but couldn't. So you can kind of see that what was being created is what the book calls this black belt, right? These highly pink areas in here become almost exclusively African American with very low home ownership rates and a lot of overcrowding that happens. This is the time when African American migration is starting to reach Grand Rapids, right? So folks are leaving the South and starting to move north. That's a trend that happened across the country in various waves. And one of the later waves was the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and that is the time when people started to move beyond Detroit into Grand Rapids for African American migration. So we started to see that happening, and people were moving into the city, and these were the only places where people were living. I think that's the next slide here.
For me, this might be a good time to pause because Chris mentioned in the chat that many of the homes still have racial covenants in them, that he would run into that when he was working in the city. And so yeah. Allison asked the question of what happens to those racial covenants. So Chris, could you unmute and kind of talk about that for just a second and what that looks like?
No, yeah, it's something, it's like an artifact of it. I always kind of looked at it as a weird artifact from another time, even though it wasn't that long ago. But they're no longer enforceable. From a title work perspective, I believe they get scrubbed from the title when the property would change hands, and you know they've remained on there on these houses for so long they just kind of get wiped. But I used to run into that once in a while, back both when I was at the city and then when I was AmeriCorps Habitat doing acquisitions. Mr. Developer and I run into that sometimes. We'd be looking for a potential acquisition. It would just be this artifact in the title work with a a lot of other stuff can show up on there too. But I just always thought that was interesting, because you see that it's something Jeremy's given this presentation and it's outstanding. We think this stuff's behind us, and it's really not. It's only just in the rear view. We're still living it. So yeah, that's about it.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you, Fernanda and Allison, for asking those questions.
Yeah. So again, this slide here is 1961, right? That is 61 years ago. To Chris's point, this is not ancient history. Maybe depending on your age, that might seem like a long time ago, but it's not so long ago in times of that is most of either our lives or at least our parents' lives were around, and maybe not in Grand Rapids at that time, but this stuff that happened in 1960s definitely directly impacts us in many ways, right? If it's only one or two generations back, if not ourselves. So from 1960 to 1968, 8,000 African Americans moved to Grand Rapids, right? That's it. And they really only had those two parts of the city that they could move to, because that's the only place they were allowed to be occupied. 95% of African Americans were living in those few blocks where housing was most available to them, because in order to live outside of there, you really had to find right, most people would not rent to you because they were allowed to discriminate, and most people did, right? And they had this incentive of saying, if I let you move in here, all my neighbors are going to be upset because their property values could go down because all of a sudden somebody else can't buy a house here. And so you had these weird incentives where people who may not have had strong feelings, may not have been, right? They may not have been racial equity champions, so to speak, which is definitely a term that did not exist there. But if you were neutral on it, you had every incentive to not be neutral in any way, shape, or form, right? You had to be willing to take sacrifices in order to, as a white person, you need to be taking sacrifices to make changes for it. And as an African American, you can imagine the amount of resistance a person would feel moving into a neighborhood when everybody else viewed them by showing up as almost a thief by definition because you were taking value away from them, right? And it just created, it creates a whole host of problems, not the least of which is African Americans ended up paying a lot more for lower quality housing because you had a few neighborhoods where they really had access to housing, and because there was this permanent demand for housing from a growing population of African Americans, there was no incentives for private landlords to invest in their properties, right? You add to that the discrimination, the perspective that, right, people don't care about it, it doesn't matter, they rent them anyway, so I don't have to do it, and those kind of individual perspectives combined with these policies mean that African Americans were paying higher rents, or when they had opportunities to purchase, they were paying higher purchase prices for lower quality housing, and experiencing worse living conditions. And it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act passed that African Americans could really have access to more housing in these small neighborhoods that were existing in the city of Grand Rapids. So, and again, I think this really speaks to how our neighborhoods were formed in the city of Grand Rapids, but it also and for people that were experiencing this, right, you're paying more rent for a worse house, you have overcrowded conditions. We all know that overcrowded housing causes more financial challenges, would lead to stress in families, which cause a whole bunch of other problems in families. You combine that with the discrimination in the workforce, where you really couldn't get the best jobs, and you'd see other people with less qualifications from you getting better jobs and earning higher income, and you'd have to pay more in rent to live in a worse neighborhood, so to speak, right? And so you have all these things going on around us, and it's shaping our city, and it creates, right, it creates situations where white folks don't ever see and interact in a meaningful way with African Americans, right? Because of that discrimination we talked about earlier, where African Americans were being excluded from social clubs, from the places where white folks could go to. And so individuals don't have the personal interactions with folks. You just have more and more reinforcement of negative stereotypes for white population that just more deeply embeds the racism and discrimination at the individual level, and creates less incentive to change any of these things in the local level. And so this continues, and it continues pretty strongly in Grand Rapids. The Civil Rights Act passed, and there continues to be significant discrimination in most of the neighborhoods immediately, right? As African Americans move into better jobs in the 1960s and start to buy homes, the Civil Rights Act passed and they can start to move into some of those neighborhoods and expand what that black belt out a little bit. All the early African-American middle-class families bought homes in these good neighborhoods, and all the white families left immediately, causing a decline in property values in that neighborhood that doesn't come back in Grand Rapids until 2015, right? The trends of population and the property values, really, the decline that happened in the 1960s doesn't get reversed until 2015 in the post, and kind of the housing boom that we're going through right now is the first time in Grand Rapids since 1960 that there's been significant property value increases in neighborhoods. And again, if you think about it from a community perspective, for African Americans, you have your wealthiest individuals, right? You get good jobs, you do everything right, you go out and buy a house, and then because you buy that house, it goes down in value, and that generation wealth is stripped from your family. And so you have all the, started talking about how housing created the middle class, right, and contributed to the creation of this middle class. And the middle class was created in the 1940s and 50s in the United States by manufacturing jobs, paying high wages, and access to home ownership. And in Grand Rapids, African Americans were denied both of those. And in most of the country, it was the same story. And so we have policies and practices that are just kind of creating a huge racialization of outcomes around economic well-being for African Americans. And there's never been any intentional effort to undo the discrimination and the social causes that this has done, right? We haven't gone back and found our way to undo this. Once it's in place, you create different generations of wealth, right? And wealth lets you do things, right? And we're not talking kind of wealth in the millions of dollars necessarily for most households, but it is enough to be able to have money to start a business, or to have money to send a kid to school, to get a college degree, right? And all of a sudden you have educational disparities that persist. And I'm not saying there wasn't education disparities at this time. Actually, that's the next piece. There's huge education disparities that come, right? But it's actually, in many ways, it is the housing policy that creates segregated neighborhoods, that allows school segregation to occur, and then communities decide to invest heavily in the white schools and ignore investments in the black schools, right? And so this slide talks about, right, the population is growing. So for the first time in 25 years, Grand Rapids starts building new schools. They pass a millage. Everybody in the city passes this. And although the inner city schools, and that's a term that starts to arise during the late 60s and into the 70s, these inner city schools, which, right, is almost a euphemism for the black schools, is they don't get the investment. We're building new neighborhoods, and all the money of these new villages goes into the Alger Heights areas, the Garfield Park areas, the edges of the city in the north and south, where there are deed restrictions that prevent African Americans from moving. And that's where we invest the majority of our educational resources. And that influx of 8,000 African Americans into those small neighborhoods means that those schools are overcrowded. And instead of addressing the challenges that exist there, we invest in the new schools, by the new buildings and the new houses, and kind of exacerbate these educational disparities that exist. Right, in the 1950s, they're establishing school boundaries, and there is clearly a racial preferences or racial demographics are taken into in designing these boundaries. So the book talks about Henry School and Congress. Right, so Henry is a school that's just south of Wealthy Street in the predominantly African American neighborhood, and campus is on Lake Drive. So not campus, it's Congress, right? And so you see the boundaries designed for the catchment area of the school, where it's Wealthy Street is taking the cutoff. Wealthy Street is basically where Henry School exists. His backyard is almost on that street, and it only takes a catchment area south of that, and nothing north of Wealthy Street. And so, again, for those of us who have been in Grand Rapids for a while, Wealthy Street has been a racial divide line for a long time in our community. I remember doing housing development in the Baxter neighborhood, kind of that south of Wealthy, near Fuller Avenue in the early 2000s, and having homes for sale. And we could, if you crossed Wealthy Street, the property value doubled for the exact same house, right? And it was just a street. But in the 1950s, the schools decided that they went to different schools, they were different neighborhoods, and put in these policies that prevented and created and reinforced this disparities that existed in our community. And so, right, by 1990, even by 2000, the Baxter neighborhood was nearly 90% African-American still. And from these policies that were set up in the 1930s, it created these dynamics, and they perpetuated well into our lifetimes. Again, and we often, right, and these divides and the unequal access to education was reinforced in a lot of different ways, right? So you have these school boundaries and these neighborhood boundaries that get drawn along racial lines, which create these, right, different demographics in schools. And then you find that the longest tenured teachers, the most experienced teachers, start to get choice of where they teach. And they do not choose to teach in the overcrowded, underfunded, poorly resourced schools. And so you end up getting the best facilities with the best teachers. And African-American students just don't have a chance to get a quality education simply because of where they live. And they can only live where they live because they are African-American. And so again, you have these lines and these mechanisms of producing success and opportunities, right? The idea of the American dream, that everybody has a chance to become and move forward in their lives and enter the middle class or even do better than that. And so many mechanisms by which white families get to participate in that dream are denied to African Americans. And this is a big part of the history of Grand Rapids. And the book talks about the NAACP of Grand Rapids and how it sued on a number of different occasions, a number of different ways to address these issues. And it tried to lead before using the courts, it went through other means and just could not make progress on things. And so, eventually Civil Rights Act passed and federal government says you can't have segregated schools anymore, right? Separate is not equal, and you cannot continue to do this and call yourself equally educating all people. And Grand Rapids resists for a long time this effort, and they continue to have segregated schools with significantly resourced very differently, significantly underfunded, underinvesting in African-American schools. And eventually there's a lawsuit that requires that Grand Rapids Public Schools integrates their schools. And Grand Rapids even though South High School, again, for those of you familiar with Grand Rapids, this is just down the street from Reflections. It's on Hall Street, right between Madison Avenue and Division Avenue there. It's a high-performing African-American school. It does very well. It's about, I think, 70% African-American or something like that at the time. I don't remember, but it has some integration in it, but it is a high-performing school. And more importantly to that, in many ways, the high school, like most high schools continue to do, is a huge social interaction, right? Schools build communities. When you have kids going to school, you start to know the parents who go to that school with you, and the school becomes a central place for community to form among African Americans. And in the mid 60s, the first kind of organized African American protests grow out of some of the policies that are implemented in South High School. I think that happened in 66 and 67. And in 68, the decision is made to close that high school. And everybody who has been going there, all the Black students have been going there, have to be bused to the white neighborhoods and attend the white high schools. So, right, so there's this notion that you need to have integrated schools, and the quote at the bottom of this is referring to the fact that rather than choosing to send white students into this well-performing, functioning, high-functioning African-American school, all the African-Americans are asked to disrupt their lives, to undo their social connections, and move into the predominantly white neighborhood, or to be bused into the white neighborhoods and attend the white schools. And it doesn't go so well. There ends up being by 68, there is a riot in racial riot in Grand Rapids Long Division. There's some and this is often connected to this particular policy where it looks like the cause of that riot or the cause of that violence that erupted was from African Americans going into I think it was a Union School or Creston and some facing significant discrimination, and then that kind of spilling over when white students follow them home from school and starting the riots breaking out around South Division in the 60s. So again, Todd Robinson talks about, right, his book really doesn't talk too much about what's happening in Grand Rapids after the 60s, but he jumps to 1980s in the conclusion and say, what is the impact of all this discrimination that has been happening in our community? And what does that mean that 12 years after the Civil Rights Act, which legally made all this stuff, right? FHA can no longer do this discriminatory practice along racial lines. Landlords could not legally discriminate against African Americans and letting them live there. Schools could not intentionally set up racially diverse or segregated schools anymore. But half a generation after that, what's the impact? And he finds that by 1980, 30% of Black families are living below the poverty line, and that unemployment is still 3 times higher for African Americans than it is for their white counterparts. Median income is still lower. Right, manufacturing jobs, which African Americans just gained access to, are starting to decline. A trend that continues for the next 30 years. And the bottom stat on this is particularly telling to me. Black representation on the school board and city commission changed little over the 20 years kind of post civil rights. Right, there were still only 1 to 2 city commission members that were African American at that time. It took until the current city commission that we have right now in place was the first time we have had a majority minority city commission in Grand Rapids. So these stats are from 1980. You can fast forward took 40 more years after this before we really saw a change in that political structure as it relates to city commission to undo some of these things that were started all these times ago. Right? And this speaks to how, although the Civil Rights Act was huge in kind of creating a legal framework that allowed things to change, work that had been done before then continues to be an underlying and build systems and structures that are continuing to perpetuate racialized outcomes, right? And you can see this at the national level, at the state level, and at the city level when you start to look at statistics. So I'm going to walk through a few statistics here today as we wrap up. And just kind of, again, I think that these just highlight how structures that are in place continue to have meaningful impact all these years later, and continue to really ensure that there is discriminatory practices and discriminatory outcomes that happen, regardless of whether it is a person who is discriminated against another person or not, right? These structures have been developed now that I would offer that it is no longer about personal preference, and who you like and who you don't like doesn't even matter anymore, because you can put Barack Obama can be elected president of the United States, and you still end up with high deportation rates and high incarceration rates, and all these other things continuing to perpetuate because these structures have been established. And so again, kind of statistics here about poverty rates, right? African Americans continue to have about 3 times the poverty rates of whites in Michigan, and and a little bit, again, if you compare Michigan to Grand Rapids, the plight of African Americans, and African Americans usually have worse outcomes in Grand Rapids than they do in the state as a whole, or in the city of Detroit, if you compare statistically there too, right? So those African Americans are slightly likely to, 1% more likely to be living in poverty in Grand Rapids than in the state as a whole, and whites are 3% more likely to, right? So you have these disparities that are going on, that are exacerbated here in Grand Rapids. What's one thing I want to look at the bottom left of this screen here, right? The likelihood of a child will move out of poverty. This idea that the American dream allows people, whoever you are, to move forward in your life and move into the middle class, has become consistently less likely over time for everybody, right? The policies that were put in place at a federal level in the 40s to help create a middle class are just not as strong now as they used to be. Taxation is different. There's a bunch of different policies that are just making it harder and harder for people to move into the middle class. And again, I think it's important for us to not ignore the fact that at the time that we created the strongest middle class in the community, we were using practices that were intentionally discriminatory and preventing African Americans from achieving it. And as those legal barriers have been removed, the overall structure has been diminished with those legal restrictions, right? So as we said, you can't discriminate against African Americans, prevent them from moving to the middle class. In many ways, we've kind of said that no one gets to do it. And we've undone these things. And so right, talked about education and access to education. And again, there continues to be huge disparities in educational attainment rates for African Americans, right? And it's again, I think these are the structures that were in place 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? It takes money to go to college. It takes resources to go to college. It takes a lot of stability and privileges in your life to be able to attain that. And so this happens slowly over time from one generation to the next. And we just have regularly and consistently denied opportunities that produce these results now, where again, in Grand Rapids, you can see that white population is more than twice as likely to get a bachelor's degree than the African American population. And this is the statistic that I find the hardest to digest, right? Health outcomes, and particularly infant mortality rates, right? So how likely are you to lose a child at the time of birth or within 1 year of birth? There is no good reason why race should be a factor in this, right? There is something going on, and this does not happen because some doctors don't care about certain babies or because they are discriminating against people intentionally in intentional ways. This is the result of a whole lot of stuff, a lot of different things, from how we invest our medical research to how biases exist in the field, to how poverty interacts with access to safe and quality housing, to a lot of stuff goes into creating stuff like this. But in Grand Rapids, the statistic here is showing that in Grand Rapids, African Americans are almost 4 times more likely to lose a child than white folks are. In Grand Rapids, if you start to break this down, the impacts of this means that for a middle income, college educated African American woman with a bachelor's degree, she is still more likely to lose a child at childbirth than a white woman with a high school degree who has Medicaid. And that is just astounding, right? It is complicated. There is a lot of things that go into making that happen, but it's not, right? I say all the stuff about income and insurance because it's not about access to the actual medical facilities, right? That is not what perpetuates these outcomes. There is a whole lot of other things going on. that contribute to this. Race has become so much a part of daily life, not just in America, not just in Michigan, but in Grand Rapids, that it literally kills children. And right, and there is no simple solutions. There is no easy ways to get above this, but it continues to be. And again, I know that our hour is quickly coming to a close here. And I hate to kind of dump all the stuff on people and say, go and have a good Friday, right? That doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem good. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to recognize what is going on and to acknowledge the truth of the situation that we're in. Again, this side is just as discouraging, right? 1980s, the disparities that are going from 1980 to 2012. And again, I apologize for the old statistic there. It's probably the first time I kind of did a talk about this book and didn't get a chance to update these numbers recently, but the numbers have not, I don't think they've changed significantly since then, that we've moved the wrong direction, right? 40 more years of conversations about cultural diversity, about inclusion, about whatever else we have been doing over this time has not significantly improved the results that we're getting. And again, these are Grand Rapids stats, right? Not Kent County. So some of the stuff in 2012, we were at a point of neighborhoods were really struggling in 2012, right? We were still in the foreclosure crisis. But even that, it's, if you think of what happened in the 1960s when the Civil Rights Act passed and African Americans started to move out of the black belt of Grand Rapids into some of the more white neighborhoods, and the white flight that happened after that, and the disinvestment that happened for years after that, it wasn't until after 2012, 2015 or so is the time when, right, we started to see property values start to increase again in Grand Rapids. We started to see a reinvestment in the physical improvements in our city in a different way. It was really 2015 is the first time white folks started coming back to Grand Rapids. Middle income white folks specifically started to move back into the city. And it happened at a time when home ownership rates were the lowest among African Americans that they had probably ever been in our city because foreclosures from 2008 to 2012 disproportionately affected African Americans, right? Through what was settled in court is clear and intentional racial discriminatory practices by banks led to higher foreclosure rates for African Americans. And that reduced the home ownership rates for African Americans at a time when the largest amount of wealth creation, right? So in some ways, the return, if the white flight of the 60s was a intentional reduction in asset value of the city to suburban communities where white folks were going, that asset value didn't get undone until the last 5 years when the middle class has returned to the city of Grand Rapids. And the people who benefited most from the exit of that assets from the city were the white middle class folks who left for the suburbs. And the people who benefited most from the return of those assets to the city are the white middle class folks who were able to buy properties in the city during the foreclosure crisis and participate in that wealth creation. And so, again, I offer that perspective just to recognize that the conversation is not just a historic one, right? We are living in a time that 20, 30 years from now, people will talk about the racial disparities that were created during the 2020s, the way we talk about the racial disparities that were created during the 1960s. Because this is happening all around us right now. And I think it's really important that we are all aware of it and paying attention to it. And again, I recognize that it's not fun or pleasant to have conversations where we look at these things and kind of face what's going on around us. But I also think it is really important that we do root our work in the truth of what's really happening around us, and that we are willing to acknowledge these things and talk about them. And I think that we need to be wrestling with the question, what does this mean for us in our work, in our organization, right? If housing has played a big part in creating structures that perpetuate racial inequality, what does it mean to be a housing organization in this city? How ought that be impacting our work? How does it already? Is there more that we can be doing through intentionality to help maximize the impact that we are having and undoing this history that none of us want to be part of? But I think oftentimes, right, you can do work in racially neutral ways that reinforce racialized outcomes, right? It's sort of like setting a table and trying to put a tablecloth on a table before you've cleaned it and cleared it off. There is no way to put that tablecloth, maybe the same tablecloth, it's going to be neutral. It doesn't care. There's no way to get that flat if you haven't done anything to think about what's underneath it. And as we move forward and continue to do our work as an organization, if we want to be addressing some of these root causes of systemic racism, we have to be intentional about looking and knowing what's happened before us and how it's created the structure and the context that we're working in, so that we can adapt and make sure that we are intentional of of undoing some of this history and not just trying to cover it up and put on policies, right? The idea that you can just have policies in place that will undo this stuff without really understanding what caused it in the first place, it just doesn't work. And so we are going to be spending sometime intentionally February. I appreciate you all listening to me today as I talk about this, but next week, sorry, we're gonna come back next week and talk about these two questions in smaller groups. So we thought we would give you a chance to take a look at them if you want to help process what was talked about today and have some time to think about what you want to talk about. But next week when we come together, we'll be breaking into groups to answer the questions of what stood out for you about the conversation, what's sticking with you, what matters to you. And we can, again, it's almost 10 o'clock or after 10 o'clock already, but I've got time, so I'll stick around here if anybody wants to keep talking about it. I know that for some of us, we need to be around other people and process these things through words in different ways. So I will stick around to anyone that wants to be doing that. But we're also gonna want to hear what you're thinking about and what this means and how this is, what you think, if anything, this means for your work here at Dwelling Place and how it connects to that. So I think we've got, not seeing anything in chat. Anything, Jen, that we need to talk about before we move on?
Yeah, lots of great shares in the chat, a lot of great feedback, Jeremy, so please read through that. Just a couple housekeeping things and we can go to the next slide, but we are looking for feedback about how to improve First Friday calls and would love to hear from you about whether or not this time is spent intentionally learning about Dwelling Place and the impact of our work and the concepts around our work. So I put a link in the chat earlier to the survey about First Friday's calls. We're going to start doing that during First Friday calls. And I'm also going to send it out to the all employee email after the call has concluded so that we can get your feedback. And I think before we end the call on First Fridays, we also like to honor staff and board anniversaries. So thank you. Jeremy, do you want to read through these for everybody?
Sure. Or I can do, or Justin, do you want to, you usually get the privilege of sharing this celebration with folks. I don't want to take that away from you if you want to do it yourself.
No, if one of you don't mind doing that.
All right. Thanks, Justin.
My voice.
Yeah. So Marge Grisher has been the property manager for 9 years here at Dwelling Place. So thank you for that service. Mason has been with us for a year now. Congratulations, Mason. Steve Meyer has been 7 years with us. Craig has been with us for 4 years, assistant property manager. Ed, our maintenance tech, has been here for 7 years. Sarah has been with us for a year now too, another 1-year anniversary. Steve Wooden is coming up on 5 years with us. So thank you all for your time with us. Yeah, Steve and Marge are up, and Ed have now been above that 5-year mark, closing in on a 10-year mark. So thank you. That's a big piece of your lives that you're spending with us in this organization and giving yourself to this work. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you so much. We are going to pause our recording now. Any additional reminders to share?